All right, everyone, welcome back to the online video lecture series for Philosophy 102 Ethics. In this video, we're going to finish up our discussion of the first section of Kant's groundwork. And we should begin by saying a few things about what Kant had in mind in the first section, or what he was attempting to accomplish. So you remember that Kant's main purpose in the first section was to argue against consequentialism. Consequentialism holds that the only thing that matters about our actions is the consequence or the outcome it produces. And of course, Mill and other utilitarians that are all consequentialists, they say, as moral beings, what we should try to do are do those actions that bring about happiness and don't bring about pain. Okay, but for them, the consequence is all that matters, right? What intent you had when you performed the action, what motivated you to perform the action, those are considerations that might tell us about what sort of person you are, whether you're a good or bad person, someone we want to hang out with or someone we want to avoid. But those sort of considerations don't tell us anything about whether the action is good or bad. Only the outcome matters. Now, Kant rejects this view, and in fact, he rejects it entirely. He says, no, actually, when we look at an action, we want to know whether it's right or wrong. We're not actually looking at what its consequence is. As we're going to see, part of this is because he doesn't think you're really in control of the consequences. He says, no, what is your principle of willing? What is the intent with which you acted? What is the way in which you acted, right? What motivated you? These are the things that Kant thinks really matters. And as we saw last time, what he wants to argue is that what we should be striving to do is act with a good will. Now, what is a good will? Well, the will is just your ability to form intentions to act using your reason. So you think about the different options, different ways you could act. You form a certain goal in mind, right? And then you carry out that action. You're using your will. You're using your reason to make decisions. And he says we should act with a good will. So a good will is just using that ability properly. So the question is, how do we know whether a will is good? And I told you last time we wouldn't be able to fully explain that until later, and well, that time is now. In this video, we're going to see what Kant means by a good will. But we should remind ourselves, one of the main conclusions he said last time is he made a very important point about what makes a good will valuable. Right? So here he says the following: reason as a practical faculty, i.e. as one that is meant to influence the will, has yet been imparted to us. Its true function must be to produce a will that is good, not for other purposes as means, but good in itself. So what's he saying here? We have this ability called practical reason, which is just your ability to think about what you want to do, to use your reason to exercise your will, to decide how you should act. And look, there's a couple things that you can do with this ability. You could form an intention to bring about some consequence, right? So last time we talked about, one thing you can do with your will is say, okay, I'm going to try to take this course of action to produce my own happiness or the happiness of others or prosperity or preservation. This is the exact words that Kant uses. But he has this whole argument for why, well, reason isn't actually the best route to get to these things. We're actually more likely to preserve ourselves and be happy if we follow instinct. So he says, no, there must be some other reason we have reason. There must be some other reason we have this higher level thinking ability and can think about what we want to do. And he says, no, the purpose of our reason must be to produce a will that is good in itself. It must be to produce a will or an intention that is good even if the consequences it intends don't come about. That's exactly what Kant means when he says the good will, and this is the first sentence of the first section, early on in the first paragraph. He says, the good will shines like a jewel all by itself. So the good will is so valuable because if you've acted with the right intention, if you have the right motive, if you've exercised your will properly, even if all the consequences you're trying to bring about don't happen, you've still done the right thing. So think about the example we talked about last time. You decide you're going to donate to charity. So you make the donation, you use your reason to think about what you should do. For whatever reason beyond your control, let's say the charity was sort of co-opted by a corrupt organization, or there was a clerical error, or whatever the case is, there's some reason why your donation didn't actually get to where it's supposed to go, you didn't help anyone. Your willingness to do the right thing, according to Kant, still shines like a jewel all by itself. It still has its own inherent value. So this is one of the major conclusions that Kant has drawn thus far. That, of course, brings up a natural question. What does a good will look like? How do we know if we've acted with a good will? And Kant tells us that to understand this, we need to inspect the concept of duty. So for Kant, there's an important connection between acting with a good will and performing one's duty. And here's the way he explains this. He distinguishes between two different ways of following the moral law. Now remember, for Kant, morality is a set of laws. Just like, there's a set of physical laws that govern the universe. There's also a set of moral laws that govern the universe. One of those is don't lie. Another is don't steal. Another is preserve innocent life, right? So these sorts of things. And he says there's two different ways that one can follow or abide by a moral law. On the one hand, you could act merely in conformity with duty. It's our duty to follow the moral law. And so one thing you could do is, well, I'm just going to conform to my duty to follow the moral law. And what would that mean? That means you do the right thing. So if the moral law says don't lie, then you don't tell a lie. But then when we look deeper and we ask, well, why didn't you tell a lie? It turns out that there was some sort of ulterior motive you had for not telling a lie. Maybe it was in your best interest. Maybe it's a habit you have. Maybe it's just something you naturally do. You're just a naturally honest person. In any case, the reason you didn't tell a lie was not because you respect the moral law itself. You didn't refrain from lying because you said, well, look, lying is the wrong thing to do, so I shouldn't lie. No, there was some other reason that you weren't lying. So Kant says, you're merely acting in conformity with your duty. You're doing the right thing, but you don't really have the right motivation. You're not really committed to the moral law. On the other hand, there's another way in which you can follow the moral law, which he calls acting from duty. And when you act from duty, not only do you do the right thing, so in this case, not only do you refrain from lying, but you refrain from lying because you say to yourself, I know the moral law says don't lie. I know I have to follow the moral law. I have respect for the law. Therefore, I'm not going to follow the law. Or excuse me, I'm not going to lie. Now, to get a better handle on this point, you can just, although he's talking about moral laws, just compare it to your attitude toward the laws of society. So, for instance, let's say there's a law in place that says you can't park on the street unless it's during these certain hours. Now, on the one hand, you might find yourself following that law but say, I have no respect for this law. Maybe you think it's unjust. Maybe you think there's no reason for it. It's unneeded. Maybe you think you're a radical anarchist and you think the government or state shouldn't even exist, so you don't respect the laws of the country. But you say, well, why do you follow? Well, I don't want the punishment. I don't want to get a ticket, right? So you could follow the law in that way. Or you could say, you know what, I respect this law. I think it's a good idea. I respect the authority of the government and I think they do have the authority to control where people park. And so I'm going to follow the law because I recognize and respect the authority of the law. And in that case, you'd be acting from duty. And what Kant is going to say is that our actions only have real moral worth when we act from duty. When we act from respect with the moral law. From respect for the moral law. And this makes some initial sense because in the example I gave, for instance, you wouldn't say the person who just follows the law merely because it's in their self-interest. You wouldn't say that person's like a great citizen. You wouldn't say that person is like a patriot. You wouldn't say this is someone who obviously has respect for the rules of the community. No, you would say, look, they're just doing what they need to do to make sure they don't get punished. And that's the idea Kant is appealing to here. So you can sort of think about it in the following way, right? When you're trying to characterize these things, there's two questions. First, did you follow the moral law or not? And then, did you have respect for the moral law? Now, one thing I didn't mention above, but he does talk about around this area in the reading, if you don't follow the moral law and you don't have respect for it, then he says you act contrary to duty. So there's no point, you've done the wrong thing. There's no point in engaging with this further. But if you follow the moral law but without respect for it, you merely act in conformity with duty. And if you follow the law but you did have respect for the law, then you act from duty. Okay. Now he uses a couple of illustrations to explain this point. The first one we'll call the shopkeeper. So here's what Kant says. He says, for example, it certainly conforms with duty that a shopkeeper not overcharge his inexperienced customer. And where there is much commerce, a prudent merchant actually does not do this, but keeps a fixed general price for everyone, so the child may buy from him just as well as everyone else. So what's the situation? We have a shopkeeper, a business owner, who's saying to himself, yeah, maybe it would be possible, in some individual circumstances for me to charge an unfair price. Like maybe, okay, a child's coming in here, they're not such a sophisticated consumer. If I tell them this is the price, then they'll just pay it, and they won't ask too many questions. So let's say this shopkeeper realizes he could act in this way, but chooses not to. Okay, and let's think about the process of reasoning as to why this person's doing that. Let's imagine the shopkeeper keeps a fixed general price for everyone, specifically because it is in the shopkeeper's best interest. Kant notices that a prudent merchant does not actually do this. Why? Well, okay, if you overcharge one child, it wouldn't, do too much. But if you keep overcharging vulnerable consumers, eventually you're going to get a bad reputation in town. People are going to stop shopping at your store. It's going to hurt your business. Okay, so Kant is imagining a shopkeeper who does the right thing but for self-interested reasons. And what does he say about this person? So in this case, the customers are served honestly, but this is not nearly enough for us to believe that the merchant proceeded in this way from duty and principles of honesty. His advantage required it. His personal advantage required charging a fair price. It cannot be assumed here that he had, besides, an immediate inclination toward his customers, so as from love, as it were, to give no preference over another in the matter of price. So therefore, the action was done neither from duty nor from immediate inclination, but merely for a self-interested purpose. So, because the shopkeeper was only acting in his self-interest, only charging a fair price so it wouldn't hurt his business in the future, we would say that the shopkeeper acts merely in conformity with duty. Now, if you imagine another shopkeeper who charges a fair price because she says to herself, well, the moral law requires it, only then would the shopkeeper act from duty. Okay, so the main takeaway here is self-interest is one thing that can cause us to act merely in conformity with duty. Right. This is just further explanation of the reasoning processes. So let's look at the second example. So a second example he gives, I'm going to call the begrudging self-preserver. Now, to sort of understand this example, one thing you just have to assume for the sake of argument, and this is what Kant in fact believed, he believed that there was an absolute moral prohibition against suicide. Now, Kant may very well be wrong about that, or he might be right about that. You might agree or disagree, but it's not really our purpose to discuss that here, so we're just going to assume for the sake of argument that's true, just so we can understand Kant's point. Okay, so Kant says, look, by contrast, to preserve one's life is one's duty. So he's saying to preserve your own life is dictated by the moral law. And also, everyone has an immediate inclination to do so. So, the idea of preserving one's life is interesting because he says the moral law commands it, but we also have a natural instinct to preserve our own lives. Right? If we're hungry, we eat. If we feel that we're in danger, we flee. We do all sorts of things just very naturally to preserve our lives and keep our lives going. And so, Suppose you say, okay, well, every day I preserve my life. I take care of myself sufficiently so that I continue to live. If something is overly risky or overly dangerous, I don't engage in it. And then you ask, well, do I deserve great moral praise? And so Kant goes on account of this, the often anxious care with which the greatest part of humanity attends to their lives has yet no inner worth, and their maxim no moral content. So he's saying, look, if you are just a normal individual who is very much wants to have their life continue going and acts in that way, and you're just acting on that natural human instinct, then that's great. You're following the moral law. But we're not going to say that you deserve any great moral praise. There's no great moral, as he puts it, no moral content to your will. You're just acting from natural instinct or natural inclination. So, but then he says, let's imagine another scenario. By contrast, if adversities and hopeless grief have entirely taken away the taste for life, if the unfortunate man, strong of soul, more indignant about his fate than despondent or dejected, wishes for death and yet preserves his life without loving it, not from inclination or fear, but from duty, then his maxim has a moral content. So he says, now if we imagine someone who's fallen on very hard times, they're depressed, they're stricken with grief, they've struggled with a lot of adversity, and now they no longer have this taste for life, as he says. They no longer have a desire for their life to continue. If this person yet decides to preserve their life, if they continue to do the things necessary so that they continue to live, even though they don't have a desire to live anymore, then this person, their maxim, the way they have acted, has moral content. So here's how we divide it. The first person, the person who preserves her life because of a natural human instinct, they only act in conformity with duty. They're not doing it because the moral law says so. They're just doing it because it's naturally what they instinctually do. But the person who acts from duty, if they recognize that continuing to do the things they need to do to preserve their life is required by the moral law. The person who says, I don't want to continue living, but I know I must because the moral law says this is the right thing. Then they act from duty. Okay, now, one further example to make this point, which in some sense is probably the weirdest of the examples. And so I'm going to call this a comparison between the kind-hearted and the begrudging philanthropist. So a philanthropist is just someone who helps others, who gives to charity, who does good things for those in need. Okay, so first, let's look at the kind-hearted philanthropist. And so I'll just sort of summarize what Kant is getting at here. So he says, to be beneficent, that means to be kind and helpful to others, where one can is one's duty. So he's saying, look, and you could, again, this is controversial, but Kant thinks there's at least some duty to help others in need. And he says, look, there are many souls so attuned to compassion that even without another motivating ground of self-interest, they find an inner gratification spreading joy around them, and can relish the contentment of others insofar as it is their work. So he says, look, there are certain individuals who just naturally help others because their psychological disposition is such that they are very compassionate, they're very caring. When they see other people who are struggling and suffering, they just naturally want to help. So the way that the way that Callanan describes the reasoning process of such a person would be, it makes me feel good to help people, therefore I ought to help others where I can. And if you think about such a person, a kind-hearted philanthropist, oftentimes we say, well, this is a great person. It's a moral exemplar. This is exactly the sort of person we should strive to be, someone who does the right thing and enjoys doing it and gets inner gratification from spreading joy around them. You'll remember that Aristotle actually thought that we wouldn't call someone benevolent if they didn't truly enjoy helping people. Because if they don't truly enjoy helping people, if you don't enjoy doing the right thing, it's not really part of your character. But here we see Kant giving the exact opposite answer. He says, I assert that in such a case, an action of this kind, however much it conforms with duty, however amiable it may be, still has no true moral worth. For the maxim lacks moral content, namely to do such actions not from inclination, but from duty. So what does Kant say? He says, well, this person is just acting according to their natural inclination. They are just lucky enough to have been born with a natural desire to want to help others. But if that's why they're doing it, because of the inner gratification, because it's their natural way of being to be helpful and kind and caring, then they're not doing it out of respect for the moral law. They're not doing it because they simply say, well, this is the right thing to do, so this is what I'm obligated to do. No, they're doing it for another reason. And so for that reason, he says, and we're going to get back to this concept in a minute, their action has no true moral worth. So think of the most kind-hearted person you can imagine that maybe you know, the most naturally caring person who loves seeing the joy on the faces of other people after they care for them. For those individuals, if that's what's motivating their actions, Kant says, well, that's great, but they're just acting in conformity with duty. Their actions have no true moral worth. Let's compare this to the begrudging philanthropist. So he says, suppose then that the mind of that friend of humanity were beclouded by his own grief. So he says, let's imagine the same person. They fall on hard times. They're struggling with a number of adverse circumstances. He mentions grief, so maybe they're struggling with a death in the family. And all of a sudden, the previous desire they had to help other people is gone. It's extinguished, right? He says, this circumstance extinguishes all compassion for the fate of others. Now, what he goes on to describe here is someone who says, okay, I know I used to have this desire to help others. It used to give me inner gratification and joy. Now, because of my present circumstance, it no longer does. I no longer have the same passion for helping the rest of humanity I used to. I have no desire to help other people. But suppose this person still acts in their previous way. Suppose they say, even though I have no inclination to want to help others, I'm still doing it just because the moral law says so. As Kant describes it, as inclination no longer stimulates him to it, were he yet to tear himself out of this deadly insensibility and to do the action without any inclination, solely from duty, not until then does it have its genuine moral worth. So he says this person who has no desire to help others but still drags themselves to be able to help others just out of respect for the moral law, this is the person whose actions have genuine moral worth. And in fact, he says, imagine even if nature had created someone who never at any point had any sympathy for others, who had a cold temperament, who was indifferent to suffering. Imagine just the most cold-hearted person you can imagine. Would he not still find within himself a source from which to give himself a far higher worth than that of a good-natured temperament may be? Certainly. It is just there that the worth of character commences. For that person who really has to struggle over the fact that they're a naturally selfish, naturally cold-hearted person, the fact that they have to struggle against that inclination to follow the moral law, if they end up following the moral law and doing the right thing and being kind and helpful to others, they deserve our moral praise. Their actions have genuine moral worth. Right, in the way Kant describes this person, they say, I can't bear to interact with my fellow human beings. However, it's the right thing to do to help those in need, therefore I'll help others where I can. So what does this show? Once again, in the philanthropist cases, if you're acting from inclination, only in conformity. If you're acting with respect for the moral law, you act from duty. And more generally, what does this show? It shows there's a number of ways in which you can act merely in conformity with duty. If you do the right thing because of self-interest, because of natural instinct, because of just your personal inclination, right? I should have probably explained this earlier, but what he means by inclination, just your personal characteristics, the way your psychology is set up, your psychological disposition. Are you kind? Are you selfish? Are you outgoing? Are you shy? Right? All those things would be part of your natural inclination. So if the reason you do the right thing is for any of these reasons, your action has no genuine moral worth. Your action only has genuine moral worth when it proceeds from respect for the moral law. And so what do we mean by genuine moral worth? That's one question here. And really he just means, well, this is probably not all he means, but one thing he means is deserving of praise. The kind-hearted philanthropist, look, it's not like they're a bad person. It's not like we're going to, punish them. They're obviously helpful to have around, good, kind-hearted people. But they don't deserve any real moral praise, because they're just doing what they were naturally inclined to do in the first place. And so Kant explains that here. He says, an action from duty has its moral worth not in the purpose that it's attained by it, but in the maxim according to which it is resolved upon. And that thus it does not depend on the actuality of the object of the action, but merely on the principle of willing according to which the action is done. So now we start to see what a good will is. You have a good will when you form the right intention. What is the right intention? To do whatever the moral law says. And if you're motivated by respect for the moral law, then the action you did is good. It shines like a jewel all by itself, regardless of what consequences are caused. So if that begrudging philanthropist who's depressed, who has no sort of sympathy in his heart, who doesn't really care about others, doesn't want to help others, if that person still donates to charity, struggling against their natural inclination, just out of respect for the moral law, and again, let's say for whatever reason, the charity bungles the donation, it doesn't get where it's supposed to go, so not only did this person not enjoy doing the action, but it also produced no good benefit, it still doesn't matter. Because a good will, its goodness is only determined by its inner worth. It's the mere fact that this person was willing to do the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing, out of respect for the moral law. That is the reason why they deserve praise. It has nothing to do with the effects of their actions. Okay, so this is a very odd concept, and especially when you first hear about the begrudging philanthropist being someone we would praise, we often say, well, I mean, that's great that they're giving, but there's something missing here, right? Shouldn't you also enjoy, to some extent, helping others? I mean, wasn't Aristotle onto something? And so I think it's important to explain a little further why Kant takes this view, which at first admittedly does seem strange. And so here I want to appeal to a concept discussed by Thomas Nagel called moral luck. So here's Thomas Nagel, a contemporary philosopher. And in this article called Moral Luck, he says the following. So he says, let me give a few examples, beginning with the type of case Kant has in mind. Whether we succeed or fail in what we try to do nearly always depends to some extent on factors beyond our control. However jewel-like the goodwill may be in its own right, an obvious reference to Kant, there is a morally significant difference between reckless driving and manslaughter. Okay, so Nagel is identifying this idea of moral luck when the way that we're seen, the way we're evaluated from a moral point of view depends on things that you just are not in control of, that are not up to you. And I'm going to come back to this example of the difference between reckless driving and manslaughter in a second, but notice how he describes moral luck. Where a significant aspect of what someone does depends on factors beyond his control, yet we continue to treat him in that respect as an object of moral judgment, it can be called moral luck. Alright, so what is he talking about? Well, let's go to two examples of a reckless driver. So, let's look at the first case, case 1. If someone has had too much to drink and his car swerves onto the sidewalk, he can count himself morally lucky if there are no pedestrians in his path. If there were, he would be to blame for their deaths and would probably be prosecuted for manslaughter. Alright, so what are we imagining? Someone goes to the bar, has too much to drink, gets behind the wheel of their car. We imagine them driving home in a reckless manner, swerving down the street. And it just so happens that nothing bad happens. Now, many bad things could happen. Maybe there were some close calls, maybe there weren't. But the person just so happens they get home safely. They arrive home, they go to bed. Case 2. Nagel says, but if he hurts no one, although his recklessness is exactly the same, he is guilty of a far less serious legal offense and will certainly reproach himself to be reproached by others much less severely. Right, so what's he identifying here? He's identifying the idea that the extent to which we blame someone in this case is going to depend on, well, what exactly did happen on that drive home? Because look, in the first case, the individual got drunk, got behind the wheel, was swerving around on the road irresponsibly. No one happened to be in the path, and so the person arrives home safely. But now in case 2, let's imagine a situation in which there just so happened to be a person in the drunk driver's path. There was a pedestrian who was crossing the street, who the reckless driver didn't see. And in the second case, let's imagine that he hits this person and kills him. Now in this case, at minimum, this person is going to be charged with manslaughter. Whereas in the first case, there would be, the only legal penalty that would come would be a DUI if the cops pulled this person over. But that in itself would be much less severe than if you actually hit someone and then you get charged with manslaughter. So in these two cases, we treat these people very differently. We look at one as close to being a murderer. We look at one as someone who just acted irresponsibly. But if you look at the two people in the cases themselves, what is the difference between them? Well, if you just look at their actions, actually nothing. Both went to the bar, both had too much to drink, both got behind the wheel of the car, and both drove irresponsibly and dangerously down the road. The only thing that was different is that in one case there happened to be a pedestrian in the way. And of course, whether there's a pedestrian in your way or not is not something that either of these drivers is in control of. And so what we see here is a situation in which the way you're treated from a moral point of view or a legal point of view depends on things that you have absolutely no control of. And one thing you might think about here is this seems somewhat unjust. How can it be fair that one driver gets such a much stronger or stiffer legal penalty when they both did the exact same thing? And I think Kant would agree with you. Now, of course, there's two ways to go. You could say, well, maybe they both should get just the punishment for a DUI. But I think Kant would go the other way. I think he would say that anyone who is caught driving under the influence, anyone who gets a DUI, should be punished as though they had committed manslaughter, as though they had killed someone. Kant was, as we're going to see, certainly one for harsh punishments. But in any case, the idea here is Kant really wants to eliminate moral luck from the equation. And so in a case like this, he would say both of these individuals should be treated the same. The consequences that came about, that's irrelevant. That was not within their control. So now you might be wondering, well, what in the world does this have to do with anything that we've just been talking about? Well, what does this have to do with the philanthropist cases we discussed? The reason it's relevant is because Kant's view here is influenced by the idea that our self-interests, our instincts, our inclinations are a matter of luck. Right? So when he says, go back to the begrudging philanthropist case, or the kind-hearted one, you compare those two individuals. You say, well, why did the kind-hearted philanthropist give to charity? Well, because they have this natural inclination, they enjoy helping other people. Okay, well, what about the people who lack that natural inclination? Was that their fault? I mean, we're imagining a kind-hearted philanthropist who was just born with a caring heart. What about the people who aren't born with a caring heart? Is that their fault? Is it to the kind-hearted philanthropist's credit that he was born with a caring heart? No, no one is in control of the sort of natural psychological dispositions they're born with. And so there's a certain unfairness here. If you're going to say the kind-hearted philanthropist gets to be praised because he has this natural kind-hearted tendency, that's just like saying, oh, the reckless driver who didn't hit anyone, they should get off because, although they were being irresponsible, they didn't actually cause anyone's death. Well, that wasn't something they were in control of. They merely got lucky. And Kant's going to say the kind-hearted philanthropist also got lucky. So our moral praise shouldn't be based on something like that. And there's a further reason here, too, why we shouldn't make our moral praise be based on the personal characteristics of individuals. So Kant says, for in the case of what is to be morally good, it is not enough that it conform with the moral law. It must also be done for its sake. If not, that conformity is also very contingent and precarious. Now, what is he saying here? Well, I have all the three cases we talked about. Let's focus on the philanthropist case here. We've been talking about the one the most. So the kind-hearted philanthropist, born with this natural desire to help others. But what if the philanthropist was not naturally kind-hearted? Would the philanthropist still have obeyed the moral law? Well, presumably not. If we're imagining that what motivated, the sole motivation for the philanthropist was their desire and gratification at seeing the people they helped, at spreading joy. If we imagine that they didn't have that disposition, they didn't have that character trait, then they probably wouldn't do it. They wouldn't have followed the moral law. Go back up to the self-preservation case. So we have an individual who has a natural instinct to preserve their life. What if they didn't have that? Then what would the person have done? Would they have still preserved their life? What if it wasn't in the shopkeeper's interest to charge a fair price? Then what would the shopkeeper have done? In each case, there's a situation in which a person is born into a favorable circumstance or just has a favorable circumstance around them that causes them to do what is morally right. But in Kant's view, that's mere moral luck. The fact that you were born a kind-hearted, caring person, the fact that it's in your self-interest to be fair to your customers, the fact that you have a natural instinct to preserve your life, you're not in control of any of these things. And so we shouldn't praise you if they cause you to do the right thing. On the other hand, all human beings have the ability to reason. We can all think about our actions. And Kant also believes because we have the ability to reason, we can figure out the moral law. So while we're not in control of what our self-interest is, we're not in control of what our natural desires or inclinations are, we are in control. We all have a choice to either respect the moral law or don't respect the moral law. And that's why for Kant, the only individuals who really, truly deserve our moral praise, whose actions have genuine moral worth, are those persons who follow the moral law for its own sake. Okay. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that makes clear the Kant's idea of acting from duty, of acting in a way that shows respect for the moral law. In our next set of videos, we'll be looking at the second section of Kant's groundwork. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.